I'm not actually sure what we're intending to talk about today. We've already met a couple of times this week. I don't see anything on the agenda. Shashi did say, no, sorry, not Shashi, Irfan, sorry, Shashi did say he'd be joining shortly, but I don't know if he has any particulars that we're intending to talk about.
I think we can mostly go through the items in the agenda which we discussed in the on Monday.
This is going to be the third time talking about it, though. What exactly are we
Okay.
going to have that's new to say? That's what I'm wondering.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it depends on if anything else comes up, it's fine. Is Paul gonna join, Maru?
That's a good question. He is around. I'm not sure why he's not here. I'll ping him.
Okay.
And I will say, for my part, I mean, some of this alpha discussion, focusing on priority is all well and good. But part of me thinks that the real important thing is actually getting people to use it. Like, fine, Huawei has priorities that they want done, and Red Hat, has priorities we want done. But I mean, ultimately, from my point of view, we need to get a critical mass of users behind this rather than just having individual companies defining the direction. Like, I mean, that's all we
Yeah.
have now, and that's where we'll go. But if we're going to discuss anything, it might be like, how do we qualify what we're trying to prioritize in terms of a wider audience?
Right. I think that should be a good discussion point today. I think instead of adding more items.
Okay. So Paul is in another meeting and it's running long. He
Okay.
should be able to join soon.
Okay. I think Ifan told you'll be late by a few minutes. I think we should get started mostly. So there's one mail thread going on like regarding the meeting time. So what do you guys think?
I mean, when he talks about multi-cluster meeting time, I
Uh-huh.
think,
It's mostly the federation meeting time. Yeah.
yeah. I think I'd probably be amenable to that. Oh, I guess the idea was that it would be every other week.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Mhm.
I guess Irfan's the person to update that. He's usually the meeting person.
Sure. Okay. Let me just share the screen.
Sure.
Sorry, the meeting notes.
What, the one with the empty agenda?
Okay.
Hello.
Oh, just a moment. Hello.
Hi, Shashi. Hi, others.
Hi, Fan.
Hello.
So, we don't have much things on the agenda. So we were just chatting like what should the priority coming taking.
Hey everybody, sorry I'm late. Shashi, were you interested in like talking through with folks if you haven't already done so? Just sharing what you and I talked about like next steps on Federation DNS about moving resources around before we transform the API or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. So we have this Federation DNS. I don't have any write up right now. So, but we have some issues which have been created. So the idea being like there is Federation DNS related code which we want to maintain outside the Federation V2 repo, so that Federation V2 will be kind of a umbrella kind of a repo from where we want to do a release for Federation. Federation DNS ideally should not do any package dependency to Federation V2. So I think we'll be using a Kubernetes builder and defining the types required for Federation DNS independently in that repo and defining the features or implementing the features. So this could be kind of a pattern for other features going forward. So that's one step, not to depend on Federation V2. So currently there is one type, CRD type, like multi-cluster service DNS type, which is in Federation V2 as of now. So for that type, it has been split. Like type is in Federation V2, and the feature actually is in Federation DNS repo. So we are going to move that particular part to make it easy. And then I think most probably we are going to make it official repo. So I'm little unsure about that process right now. Yeah, we'll try to figure that out. Yeah.
And what's going to be the integration with? I mean, I guess there's a piece here that sort of is common between like federation and multi-cluster. Is there any eye towards moving that into maybe its own repo so it can be shared, and having federation and multi-cluster be in separate repos from that? And what I'm talking about is like federated cluster and the cluster controller would seem to be common elements. And also, I mean, federated service to some degree. I mean, that's how you know what to track in the underlying clusters at present. Is how would you see that be? How do you see that relationship evolve as you try to move it into a separate repo and establish a degree of autonomy?
So right now, Maru, there's actually no dependency in Federation DNS on
Yeah. Oh, I understand that. I'm talking about the pieces that are currently in the Federation repo that do have dependency. Moving that type into the federated DNS repo wouldn't remove that dependency. It would have to evolve to change into something that's less dependent.
So do we actually have dependency in Federation V2 on the multi-cluster DNS pipe?
Not that way. It's the reverse. Like there's a controller that maintains those resources that depends on federated cluster and the cluster controller and federated service.
Yeah. So I think that like there are probably steps that we can do. It sounds like I personally need to read up a little bit more on like the controller part that's in Federation V2. But like the model that Shashi and I were kind of discussing, exploring is one where like features exist in independent like repositories, and and Federation is like the umbrella where you go to get them all like into one another with versions that will work together. So yeah, I think there's additional exploration work that needs to be done. But one thing that, like, has been
Paul, Guru, like before we dwell into that, actually, like,
go ahead.
so what's a real benefit we are going to get if we are trying to split the code into
Shashi, it sounded like you started talking.
Yeah, yeah. Am I audible? Like, is it clear?
Yes, Shashi, you are audible.
Oh,
Probably
okay.
Paul might not be able to
Okay.
listen.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're
So
very clear.
actually, yeah, before we go too further into that, like, what's the real benefit of splitting the code into multiple repos? Uh, does it outweigh like the all the problems, like operational issues?
I would suggest that it does, both because the tooling is kind of geared towards having things be more sort of, I don't know, like
Hello? No, I think we lost you.
You might be losing Maru's audio. I would say it potentially outweighs the trouble of making them in separate repos. It means that we can get a broader spectrum of folks that are interested in collaborating on parts of it. I do think in this particular case, Shashi, it might be. I wonder if you and I need to like write something up about what we think we should do and make sure that we've fully covered like what we think the transformations are on paper to make sure that we're actually doing the right thing.
Sure. Yeah,
Paul,
but
actually, I also have the same question. I'm wondering what really might be a use case or a tool set or tooling that might benefit from doing this segregation. I mean, I am not asking this question to go in the direction that we shouldn't do it or not do it. I'm just curious about the same.
So to me, Irfan, I think the answer is that like I think it's easier to iterate on smaller pieces. Two, and these are just my own subjective opinion here. Two, I think that we don't have a lot of feedback from users yet that like what we have built so far in Federation V2 is okay to continue building on without changes. And in general, I think that if we can make modular pieces that are drawn together and work together well as a whole, it means that if you only want to use, for example, if you only want to use multi-cluster DNS and Federation Read API, for example, that a lot of people, if they only want those two pieces, they don't want to install like the whole kit into Boodle to get them all. So if we build a single repository that has oodles of features, I tend to think that the people that will want to collaborate with us are only going to be people that want all of those features. And that people might be turned off by a single repo that has a whole slew of different features. That's my subjective opinion. It has borne out with a couple folks that I've talked to in the community, but I'm just one person with my own limited experiences. That's my subjective opinion.
Yeah, I understand what you are saying, Paul, but I think we had this discussion, and the whole reason we are segregating APIs is to give weightage to the opinion that you just mentioned, that it's better to have the stuff built using modular pieces, which can be broken down or utilized in a single way. I believe the right answer might be to be able to release, or a user can should be able to build say only needed functionality out of say Federation V2 repo or a single repo that we are talking about. Why I say this is because there is a big benefit in doing stuff inside the same repo in terms of usage of especially dependencies and tests. So all the integration tests, C2E tests that we are building, they would be useful if we remain inside the same repo. But if you are trying to build up something parallel or something, I mean, maybe a small functionality, but maybe somewhere else, then you have to build the same CI system, same integration tests, C2E tests there also, until you have some mechanism of reusing whatever we have here. And dependency management. I think Maru was also pointing out on that about the dependencies.
I mean, we need to split the dependencies in a way that makes sense so that we can consume it from multiple independent repos. But I think it's worth it. Like this is direction Core Cube is going, and I really would prefer that we don't kind of continue down a path that is kind of deemed like non-productive.
I'll tell you subjectively, like when I've been talking to folks about
By like the community in terms of tooling. Like there's already the testing frameworks repo that we're consuming, and the intention of that is that it allows subordinate repos to not have to develop their own CI infrastructure and testing infrastructure. So we're kind of on that path already, I think.
Yeah, I feel like we're in a position where we don't have like a really good way to end what we built so far in Federation V2 with like multiple clusters at the same time. And so I'm not sure that we're actually getting very much by adding problem space to what we have to test in Federation V2. Like I'm inclined to think that if we have focused pieces, that it may be simpler to individually test them. And if we have integrations where they work together, test those in Federation or whatever project brings all the pieces together.
Okay.
Again.
Okay. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not saying, as I said earlier, I'm not objecting to doing this. I'm just sort of putting out my thoughts. Like these are the thoughts that came to my mind when I actually gave a thought about if we want to move that Federation, a multi-cluster DNS API out externally, and then you have to probably test it out or do something so that it's releasable. Right now, I guess Shashi just did some basic stuff so that a controller could be run from that separate repo. If you're releasing an API, you probably have to do much more than that.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Like, there is quite a lot of common code, like the say federated informer, which might need to be used in all the repos, and the CI again. You need to build CI for each repo, and there is a release management over it. I do think we should not get we should not get down with this operational.
So I wonder if, as a next step, well, let me ask this question. Does anybody think that we conclusively know the right way to do this? Because I don't think that we do. I do think that in the case of Federation DNS, like we do have like an odd situation, as Shashi has like observed earlier in this meeting, that like the API is in one place and the actual features in another. I think that we should put them in the same place. The Federation V2 repository is like the same place that makes the most sense for them to live until we can take a look at untangling like dependencies like federated informer, federated cluster, etc. that like are the essentials that you would need to build other features for Federation V2. Does it make sense to like take Federation DNS and put it into Federation V2 as the next step?
I didn't clearly get it, Paul. So what you are suggesting is Federation, by Federation DNS, you mean the library which actually, which is part of the controller, the Federation DNS controller, which updates the DNS records to be put inside Federation V2. That's what you're suggesting, or something
I'm
else?
saying that it seems like that might be the best next step instead of moving the API into Federation DNS.
I think the current split, I think, makes more sense than what you're proposing.
I don't think so, because Federation DNS has to vendor all of Federation right now.
Right, but that's because you're talking about it has to vendor Federation V1.
No, it vendors Federation. It has code that I think, Shashi, you brought in from Federation V1, but it vendors Federation V2 to get the client multi-cluster DNS record.
Right. I mean, that to me, that's kind of in the near term. That's because we have generated clients, and that's not a long term. Like that's going away. So the piece that it would have to continue to vendor would be the API over the longer term. And so I think there's a good case to be made that the API be separately vendorable. I mean, I've had discussions with Jonathan about cluster registry that, like when we were initially trying to vendor it into Federation V2, it's like, wow, this is really painful. Is there a way we could do this better? And the suggestion was, well, if you had a repo with just the API, just like you have Cube API, then you could vendor that, and you wouldn't get any stuff that you don't actually need. And I kind of think that's the direction we want to go versus let's just stuff everything into Federation V2.
So I agree. I think it's weird that the controller that backs this feature isn't in the same place as the API, and that's what is overall informing my motivation that the end goal should be one where like the different functional areas that have like discrete features are in separate repositories that are independently useful. So people don't feel like they have to accept the whole system if they're only interested in one piece, and that the integrations between them are like are developed in a project that's like the umbrella project that brings those individual pieces in as dependencies and provides glue to make them work together. But it seems really weird to me right now that we have like a multi-cluster DNS and like one controller and one repo, and then the rest of the features in another repo.
Well, the things that are in one repo are, they're logically isolated. Like the idea that, oh, everything has to be in the same repo because they're all somehow related. Like, if your goal is making things independently consumable, I'm not sure why you want to stick everything in the same repo and actually make that maybe harder to do.
Yeah, my point in putting them into the same repo was a response to the fact that there is this like shared set of infrastructure resources that you just brought up as the reason not to pull it all the way out. Right. I was thinking that as an interstitial step so that we can keep the whole implementation in one place while we examine what would it take to make those shared pieces independent.
I guess I don't see why you'd want to put everything together just as a step towards breaking it back apart. Like if we already have things, like what's wrong with just leaving things the way they are while we figure things out? It's already working.
I agree with you, Muru, for what it's worth.
I'm having trouble understanding how you would want to arrive on the future I described where multi-cluster DNS is independently usable then. I'm hearing don't combine Federation DNS into Federation V2 as a next step, and then also hearing don't move the stuff that's in Federation V2 into Federation DNS. So At this point, I'm
I,
for suggestions for what the next steps might be for us to know what to do.
I mean, that's, I think, a matter for exploration. I think logical next step for me would be like taking a look at whether we could move the API into its own repo so that it could be consumed regardless of what functionality you're trying to implement against it in the Federation repo. And if you want to use that API, the vendoring semantics of Go mean you have to take the whole thing. And that's not really desirable if modularity is the goal.
I'm sorry, are you making a suggestion, or I'm having trouble understanding?
I'm sorry if I'm not being clear. The TLDR is, I think the next step is exploring separation of the API that's currently in Federation v2 into its own repo that can be consumed by both Federation v2 and multi-cluster DNS and anybody who wants it. Does that make sense?
I don't understand how that's different than what I've suggested specifics about in a couple of ways, but maybe we can
my understanding, or what I heard you say was you want to put multi-cluster DNS, the federated DNS repo, that the contents of that into the Federation v2 repo. Was I misunderstanding?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was suggesting as like a next step, so that we could get the feature into a single place, which I think is desirable, and determine at that point, do we need to extract the shared pieces that are like federated cluster, et cetera, into a separate dependency that both Federation v2 and multi-cluster DNS or Federation DNS can use.
Yeah, I'm not really seeing why that's a good intermediate step, and maybe we could talk offline about it because maybe I'm missing something.
Can I maybe offer to try and help? And please feel free to cut me short if I'm not helping. So I think I understand the consensus opinion to be the fact that we want small, independently consumable pieces of code. And for those pieces of code to explicitly vendor in whatever dependencies they might have. So to take a concrete example, if I have a federated DNS controller, it has inputs which are a set of API objects, probably at the moment clusters and federated services, etc. And it produces some set of outputs, in this case, probably DNS records. And there's a bunch of code that does that. So there's a federated DNS thing, and it needs to be able to import the APIs that it depends upon and the libraries that it depends upon to interact with the DNS servers. And it needs to be buildable and testable. And right now, many of these pieces are all bundled into one repo, Federation v2, not including the federated DNS, but most of the other stuff. And if I understand correctly, where we want to end up is where we have independent repos for the smallest possible reusable components, and that they should vendor in whatever external dependencies they have, API objects, libraries, etc. So is that, forgetting about what the next steps are, is that a common future goal that we share?
I think that is very accurate and well put.
Okay, so the next question is, how do we get there? And it seems like for some of the components, federated DNS, for example, we're already halfway there in that it is in its own repository. It vendors in the stuff that it needs, which happens to be a big glob of the entire repository of Federation v2, but that's hopefully a temporary situation. But it is self-contained in that it has its own API, its own controller, and it depends on various things in Federation v2. Is that accurate?
Sorry, I have bird washing at my house, but I think what you said was accurate.
Okay.
No, Quinton, there is a slight difference. So the API basically is currently in Federation V2 repo, and
Okay.
controller and rest of the stuff is in a separate repo.
Okay. Okay. I understand that correction, and that makes sense. So, what it seems we want to do is remove individually reusable pieces out of the Federation V2 repo and put them in separate repos where they can be consumed independently.
Yes.
Okay. And I think I agree with Maru that as an interim step, moving stuff that's already outside of Federation V2 repo into Federation V2 repo doesn't seem to make sense. We're just going to have to remove it again. So it seems like busy work.
I think that's a matter of opinion, but that's fine. Accepted.
Okay. Okay. So maybe the next steps are to identify what we consider to be the independently reusable pieces that are currently all housed in Federation V2. Off the top of my head, that would seem like each of the API objects that we have, each of the controllers that we have, and each of the reusable libraries that we have, things like clients, API clients and DNS libraries and caching. There was one of them was mentioned earlier. I forget what it's called. Federated Informer, I think it is. So those kinds of things seem like independently reusable libraries, and it seems like we would like to put each one of those in their own repo and have it independently, at least unit testable, and then have a place where we can pull these things together into coherent features or products, if you like.
Yeah, I think that is very close to what's in my own head.
Maru, does that make sense to you?
I think the only point of confusion was the wisdom of pulling everything together as a prelude to pushing it back apart. So
I agree. That seems to be an as yet agreed upon thing. So let's put that on the side and say we'll figure that out afterwards. But we do, if I understand correctly, we do have a common end.
Yes, and I'm agnostic on how we get there. I think there are an arbitrary number of right ways to do it. If people are open to looking at what are the right things to tease out of Federation V2 that we can extract and then vendor back into Federation V2 and also multi-cluster DNS, I think that would be a great way to do it.
Awesome.
Yeah, and about this, I have one counter argument to this. Like, I don't clearly think that putting all the pieces, like you have a feature, for example, multi-cluster DNS is one feature, sync controller is one feature, or sync loop or sync mechanism is one feature. All that stuff into its own repo has its own overhead. And I don't see segregating that out into its own repos is the solution for that.
Yeah, that makes sense what you're saying, Irfan. So something I was going to add earlier, and maybe I'll do it now, is having things independent. It's entirely possible, I believe, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, to have independent things in the same repo. So
there is.
Packages are meant for that, right? Golang packages
DNS
are
provider,
the main point of that.
A concrete example is the DNS provider library was sitting in the Federation, in the Kubernetes repo actually for quite some time, as was the whole of Federation. But DNS provider is the library I'm thinking of. Informally, it had no dependencies on the rest of Kubernetes, other than the explicitly imported items. So it knew about, in fact, the DNS library, it knew very little about Kubernetes at all, actually. In fact, nothing. Now, I will point out that it is difficult to enforce that minimizing those dependencies if things are in the same repo, just simply because it's just too easy to say import XYZ, which could be any code in that repo. And those things creep in over time if you don't have a fairly strict enforcement of removing unnecessary dependencies. So the question becomes, I believe, is the cost of actually putting them in their own repo and running their own unit or testing infrastructure and permissions on the repo and whatever other overhead there is associated with a repo, does that justify, or is that justified by the fact that the dependencies between the repos are more easily kept strictly well-defined?
Yes, and I think for me I think the answer is yes, and my reasoning is that maintaining like this separation is key to, I think, enabling third-party contribution. Because if we have everything in the same repo, it's very easy to allow integrations within that repo without even thinking about it.
Yeah,
and that makes it harder for third-party contributors to integrate because they don't have the same advantage. So,
yeah, I agree with you. Sorry, was somebody talking?
Well, one more thing. I should say that this is kind of the goal that we're looking towards. I'm not saying we have to hit it immediately. It's more like if we keep this in mind and decisions that could go one way or the other are made on the side of we're going to try to separate these things out, hopefully before too long. Eventually we'll get there. And I do think there is risk involved in this approach. And I think Irfan's concern about the testing is probably the one that is foremost in my mind. And I'm not too concerned that we'll be able to solve it because, like I said, the wider Cube community is kind of facing the same challenges. So there's a lot of smart people thinking about how to do this. We're not alone.
So for me, I think that as you put very eloquently, Quentin, I think we have a shared idea of what we think should happen, but my read of the uncertainty in the room is really one around we're not certain if the additional overhead of multiple repos is worth it, and I think I would be okay if we decided that we want to, since we don't yet have a specific request, as far as I'm aware, to make any particular thing independently usable. We could try as an approach for now to avoid having to make the spend on that extra overhead until we thought it was necessary. It would be fine, I think, to be very disciplined and just build things separately in Federation V2 for now, with the caveat that as we've just talked through, it can worm its way into inadvertently that there are integrations that make it hard to tease things out in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I would prefer not to, stop the train while we figure out how to pull things apart and put them in their own repos. We've done that in the past before, and it held things up. One approach that might work well is to say whenever anybody wants to reuse a piece of what's in Federation V2, first of all, I think up front we should just make a list of what we believe the independently reusable components are.
Yeah.
So that we know what they are. And then when anyone wants to vendor in anything in Federation V2, we can refer them to the list and say, which of these things do you actually need? Presumably you don't need all of Federation V2. You're actually after some subset of these things. And then as part of that exercise, we pull those pieces out and so that they can be independently vendored. And that unfortunately puts some of the burden on the person wanting to reuse the stuff, which is not ideal. But hopefully that's doable. The other quick question I had was, so Shashi now has concrete experience with operating an independent repo, being the Federation DNS stuff, federated DNS. How big is that overhead? I mean, presumably you have test infrastructure running there and permissions on that repo and bots and whatever else. How big is that effort?
To answer that, I do feel this overhead is going to be too big because you need to come up with your own CI infrastructure. Then you need to think about how are we going to plan this release artifacts. You're going to give out a separate container, and then that should be deployed and consumable by the user. And also, for a user, for example, if he wants both of them, okay, now you need to depend on both the repos, vendor in both the repos, and try to use that. So I do feel there's a lot of overhead in maintaining it in multiple repos. Okay, so maintaining it in a single repo reduces that overhead a lot. So that's where Kubernetes started. So it became too big for other tools to support. That's why we tried segregating functional domain. So, but I do believe Federation is a lot less compared to what Kubernetes was. So I do think at the moment the trade-off could be like maintaining everything in a single repo, but still modular could be a good way forward. I do believe that.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very pertinent observation. So Kubernetes, the whole of the Kubernetes project has thousands and thousands of contributors, and I don't know the exact number, but hundreds of commits every day. Federation V2, even if you take all of the bits together, has, 6 or something contributors and substantially less than hundreds of commits per day. So I don't think we should necessarily delude ourselves into believing that it is the same size problem. What I have seen from experience, though, is as things grow, it becomes much more difficult to split them up later than earlier, as has been experienced by the Kubernetes, the rest of Kubernetes. So, whoa, something happened there.
I think somebody's mic is giving feedback. So whoever is not speaking can mute, please.
Okay. I don't want to take up too much of the meeting, but just Shashi, to get a sense of how big that effort is. So you run you've developed the federated DNS stuff, and you've essentially run the repo in the sense of test CI/CD stuff and releases and testing documentation, whatever. As a percentage, how much of your time is spent building the DNS, federated DNS code versus the overhead of running that repo?
Actually, yeah, to answer that, I don't have a CI as of actually. So to build the CI, I need to depend on the Federation repo. So I should be, first thing is like, I should be able to deploy a Federation. So the prerequisite for me having a CI would be like, I should be running a Federation control plane first.
And just to be clear, I'm not totally convinced that overhead needs to be borne by federated DNS controller. So I would not necessarily jump it to the conclusion that let's assume in a world where we have split Federation V2 up into 20 repos. So there's one for each API group or API, and one for each controller, and one for each library, etc. I'm not sure that every one of those should be running end-to-end tests with multiple clusters and all of the other stuff.
Yeah, if we are splitting smaller building blocks out, like we do not need to have continuous integration that tests those, like, except in a vacuum.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I would call those component tests. So take federated DNS as an example. If I had some tests that built a federated DNS controller, you know, generated a couple of API objects that it depends upon, and verify that it generates the right DNS records, that's the kind of testing I would imagine that repo would have, as opposed to you know, connecting to a bunch of, well, maybe it's a bad example because maybe you can't actually test the DNS controller unless it has clusters and real services that it can monitor. But in general, I think the testing per repo should be minimal and focused on the specific thing in that repo rather than a full integration with all possible use cases for that component.
Yeah, I agree with that, but we also need to have the end-to-end, at least a single test case to test out that feature somewhere. It should be hosted.
I wonder if that isn't the job of the what we can call the integration repo, or this repo that Paul referred to earlier, which pulls in all the dependencies to produce what I would call a product.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Federation V2 is probably various flavors of it, but one can imagine having a repo which pulls in all the dependencies, all the different controllers that it needs for a functioning Federation V2 control plane, and tests that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So practically speaking, what do we think is the way forward in the case of DNS? Do we need to do anything here? Should we look at like, what are the shared pieces between Federation V2 and multi-cluster DNS that we might need to extract into a third place? Like, I'm wondering, I'm sincerely asking folks, like, if we feel like we know what to do.
That sounds to me like a good next step.
So this maybe is a good paper example for us to figure out, like, realistically, what components do we think need to be split out from Federation V2, and what's the associated, like, testing overhead for those? Yeah. I will just complete my thought really quickly. Like, I have been imagining that it's probably too much to go to the degree of putting, like, federated informer and X or Y controller in their own distinct repos, and that maybe there's something that's like Federation Bedrock or something that you could extract.
Yeah, Paul and Maru, before that, the presumption, right? So we were talking about, like, for a user to be independently consumable, right? So mostly, if it is a single repo also, when we do something like a code level imports, right? It won't import all the things, right? Only the Go packages. Am I correct, right? Like, user is still can do only part import, just the packages they need, like just the APIs they need. So I don't think it's a difficult stuff, but instead, if you have too many repos, so I think that might come to.
Yeah, I definitely think we do not want too many repos. I tell you what, it sounds like the action item here is Shashi and I, maybe you and I can, like, pair up and let's look at everything that's like in Federation V2 and in multi-cluster DNS, and, like, do a write-up on extracting shared pieces and what it will look like at the end, and then we can see what we think the overhead would be and whether we think it's something we need to do right now. How does that sound for specifics?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Cool. And I think the other only item was about the meeting time. We didn't conclude that, I believe, right?
Sorry, I have pressure washing happening right next to my ear, and I didn't hear what you said.
I mean, the one item which is under discussion in the mailing thread, right? So about the time of the meeting and the frequency.
Yes, yeah, we should talk about that.
Yeah.
Why don't you introduce that topic, Shashi?
Yeah, I think it would be definitely good for us if it is 8 p.m. So I think I'm okay to the new proposal by Quinton. So what do you guys feel? Is it too early?
It would be okay for me. I think we're talking about moving this. Wait, how many hours forward?
2 hours earlier.
Okay, that would be okay for me. It might be tough for folks on the west coast of the U.S., but I'll let others say if they have their concerns.
Yeah, I don't know how many people are aware of the email thread that happened yesterday on this topic, so maybe I can just give a very brief overview. So we have at least one person who's very keen to actively contribute from China, and I would like us to have more of those over time. It's extremely difficult for people in India, China, Australia, etc., to attend a meeting that is held at the current time because it's close to the middle of the night for them. So one proposed improvement to that would be to shift the current meeting 2 hours earlier. It has the explicit disadvantage that people on the West Coast in the US would have to attend at 7:30 a.m. I'm one of those people. I don't have a problem with that, but I can't speak for the rest. I think Maru is here as well. I don't know what his feelings are on 7:30 a.m. The exact day I think we can make flexible because it would make it happen before any other Kubernetes meetings. And I would just point out that people who are very actively involved in the development of the project, obviously their opinions weigh heavier than those who may just be listening in, because presumably they could listen in on a video recording at any time that suits them. So right now we seem to have somewhere in the order of 4 to 6 active participants in these meetings. And we have an additional one wanting to join from China. So the aim is to try and make something that works well for all of those people. 2 of the 4 to 6 active participants at the moment are in India. And it is, what time is it there now? 11 p.m., something like that?
Yep, it's 11 p.m.
Yeah, so that's clearly not ideal for them. So if we moved it 2 hours earlier, it would now be 9 p.m., much more tolerable. Does anyone object to moving it 2 hours earlier? If so, please speak now.
Yeah, West Coast folks. Maru, and who else is there? Like, in which zone Lindsay works?
No, I'm on EST.
Ivan?
I'm also on Pacific time. Yes.
Is that fine for you?
Yeah,
Like it'll be 7:30, quite early.
Yeah, I don't object. I mean, I don't think there's a convenient time for everybody. So if everybody shares if we have a distributed time that everybody can manage, then I think that's fine. I'm okay with that.
Sounds great. There is another alternative, which is to have 2 meetings, one at a time that is convenient for people in the more westerly time zones and one that is a time more convenient to those in the easterly time zones. My past experience is that doesn't work very well. If you have half the people attending half the meetings and the other half attending the other half, it's not worth the trouble. So I would favor one where everybody can attend, even if it's not ideally convenient for everyone. Cool. So we haven't heard any objections. Let's just do it.
Okay, I'll update the meeting notice. So Wednesday is fine, or should I suggest another day, or somebody else wants to suggest another day? Wednesday is fine for us, like folks from India.
Yeah, and for me too. I think Paul mentioned that he might have a clash. Paul, does that apply?
Sorry, pressure washing. What's the question?
The question is, if we move it 2 hours earlier, can we leave it on today, Wednesday, once a week? Or does that cause a problem for you?
Let me double check, but I think that will actually be fine.
Okay, cool. We'll move it accordingly and object if we don't like it, we'll move it again.
Yeah, I think that works fine for me.
Cool.
Okay. Thanks, guys. I'll update the meeting notice for the next week and the week onwards.
And just a reminder, don't forget to update all the wiki pages and other places where that thing, there's a title in the meeting minutes and there is a date on the SIG wiki page, etc., etc.
I'll do that. I'll
Make
do
sure
that.
they all get updated. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, one last thing before we log off. So far, we haven't done an announcement of the release. We actually did cut out the release last week. So we have a release page, but we haven't made any announcement. So if nobody else is planning to send a mail or to the common mailing list like SIG multi-cluster and maybe to Kubernetes dev, then I'll do it.
Yeah, Irfan, I had the action item to do that, but I hadn't gotten to it yet. I was on my list for today.
Cool. If you can do it today, it'll be great because it'll be your day itself. I would anyways do it tomorrow.
Yeah, I tell you what, why don't I draft it in a Google document and I can share it with you and make sure you're cool with the wording. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, you can send it out also. It's just an announcement, so I don't think you can run it with Maru or Quinton. Anybody can.
Sure. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you next week.